Welcome to The Boring Historian. Tonight we'll be exploring what German soldiers experienced on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more calming history for sleep. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? I'd love to know. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let's step quietly into the German side of D. The night of June 5, 1944, settled quietly over the Norman coast. Along the cliffs, dunes, and long stretches of sand, German soldiers manned their posts in bunkers and observation towers that formed part of the Atlantic Wall. The air was heavy with the salty scent of the sea, and though the world seemed peaceful, it was not true peace, merely a fragile pause before what none of them could yet imagine. In the small hours, soldiers busied themselves with ordinary routines, the kinds of things that seemed timeless in any garrison. Some sat hunched over wooden tables inside their damp concrete shelters, scribbling letters home by the dim light of lanterns. The paper was scarce, the ink often smudged, but the words mattered. They wrote to wives, to mothers, to children far away in German towns, promising to return when the war was done. Some letters carried reassurance, though the writers themselves felt uncertain. Others poured quiet truths onto the page, confessions of fear or longing or exhaustion after years of war. Others played cards, the soft shuffle and clink of coins punctuating the silence of the night. Cigarette smoke curled lazily around the low ceilings, drifting toward vents in the bunker walls. A few men shared a flask of schnapps, passing it between them as though the small burn of alcohol could hold back the tide of loneliness. Conversation was subdued, no laughter, no boasting. The war had already gone on too long for such things. Outside, the shoreline stretched dark and still. The tide lapped gently against the sand, as if mocking the vast fortifications that bristled along the coast. Soldiers on watch paced the edges of their posts, boots crunching against gravel, rifles slung loosely over their shoulders. Some gazed out to sea, straining their eyes into the mist, half convinced they might glimpse movement on the water. The threat of invasion was never far from their thoughts. They had been told it was coming. The Allies would strike eventually, but no one knew when, or where. Months of waiting had dulled their nerves, so much so that warnings of an attack often felt like rumors meant only to keep them on edge. That night felt no different at first. Patrols returned with nothing unusual to report. The officers, too, seemed weary of constant vigilance. Some dismissed their men early, urging them to get rest before another uneventful morning. A false calm settled, convincing many that nothing significant would happen. The idea of thousands of ships gathering just beyond the horizon seemed too vast, too unreal to imagine. For a few, sleep came quickly. They curled up on narrow bunks or on straw pallets laid along the cold floor, boots tucked neatly beneath them. Their dreams, if they came at all, were uneasy ones, dreams of distant homes, of childhood streets, or of endless marching across muddy fields. Others remained restless, unable to close their eyes, staring instead at the damp concrete ceiling above them. The air felt heavy with something unspoken, as though the sea itself was holding its breath. A radio crackled faintly in one bunker, tuned to a German broadcast. The voice on the air offered no hint of alarm, only the steady rhythm of wartime updates. Reports from the Eastern Front, reminders of duty, assurances that the Atlantic Wall would hold. To the men listening, it was background noise, little more than a voice against the silence. Just before midnight, the coastal wind picked up. It whistled through gaps in the bunkers, rattling loose shutters and carrying the scent of seaweed inland. A few soldiers wrapped themselves tighter in their greatcoats, pulling collars high against their necks. One man, standing alone on an observation point, struck a match to light a cigarette. As the flame flared briefly, he squinted toward the horizon, wondering if the distant haze he thought he saw was merely fog or something more. The quiet hours dragged on, slow and uneventful. The men remained unaware that across the Channel, the greatest armada in history was already assembled, thousands of ships filled with Allied soldiers, waiting for the dawn. For now, though, the German defenders knew only stillness. They carried on with their small rituals, clinging to the normality of routine, unaware that this would be the last night of calm they would ever know. As the clock struck past midnight, the bunkers remained alive with small sounds, the scratch of a pen on paper, the shuffle of cards, the sigh of boots unlaced at last. And outside, the endless sea whispered against the shore, as though it knew what awaited them when the sun rose. The first hints of dawn crept across the Norman sky, though the night still clung stubbornly to the shoreline. A faint grey light shimmered on the water, blurring the horizon where the sea met the clouds. For the men stationed along the Atlantic wall, it was the hour when time seemed to drag the slowest. Sleep was a memory for some, interrupted by the cold, damp air that seeped through their uniforms. Others remained on watch, their eyes fixed outward, searching the endless expanse of the channel. It was during these uneasy moments that whispers of something unusual began to spread. A patrol returning from the coastal edge reported faint silhouettes on the horizon, shapes in the mist, they claimed, moving slowly, though perhaps it was only imagination. The channel was often deceptive. Shadows of clouds, drifting fog, or fishing boats could play tricks on tired eyes. The men, weary from months of waiting for an invasion that never came, listened without alarm. Some even chuckled quietly, shaking their heads at yet another false sighting. The officers, too, brushed off the reports. They had been told to remain vigilant, but constant rumors had worn thin their patience. Time and again, patrols claimed to see something stirring on the water, only for it to vanish with the shifting weather. Messages were passed along the chain of command, but they were received with the same skepticism. Another false alarm, muttered one lieutenant, more interested in finishing the last of his coffee than entertaining the idea of an invasion at this very moment. In the bunkers, soldiers sat in muted silence, their bodies hunched against the chill. Some sipped from tin cups, their coffee bitter and lukewarm, while others rubbed their hands together for warmth. The sea could be heard just beyond the thick walls, a constant rhythm that seemed both soothing and ominous. Each crashing wave echoed through the stone, blending with the groans of shifting timbers and the faint rattle of loose equipment. It was the kind of sound one grew used to after months of garrison life, a lullaby of monotony that made time feel endless. For many, this routine dulled their senses. The prospect of invasion, once terrifying, had become abstract. Orders reminded them daily that the Allies would strike, but no one knew when, and no one believed it would be now. The Atlantic Wall had stood for months, a fortress of concrete and steel, its bunkers and gun emplacements carved into the coast like jagged teeth. The propaganda had told them it was impenetrable. Some soldiers clung to that belief, convincing themselves the enemy would never dare to attempt what German engineers had fortified so heavily. Yet even in this false calm, tension lingered. A young soldier seated by the bunker entrance drummed his fingers on the wooden stock of his rifle, his ears straining at every distant echo. Another adjusted the belt around his waist for the third time, muttering under his breath about the strangeness of the air. "It feels different tonight," he whispered to no one in particular, but his words carried into the silence. The others glanced at him, then quickly looked away, unwilling to entertain such thoughts. Overhead, the sky remained low and heavy, a ceiling of mist that thickened as dawn inched closer. The occasional gull called out, its cry sharp and lonely as it circled above the beach. For a moment, everything seemed almost ordinary, the kind of morning that had repeated itself countless times before. The false calm stretched on, lulling the soldiers into the belief that this, too, would pass as every other long night had. Still, unease gnawed at the edges of the silence. The patrols insisted that something was out there, faint and distant, but real. A shape here, a flicker there, like a mirage upon the water. Yet the officers waved them away, advising them to rest or return to their posts. "The channel plays tricks," one officer said. "Don't let your nerves fool you." His voice was steady, but even he lingered a moment too long at the observation slipped, staring into the horizon as though unsure of his own certainty. Inside the bunkers, men continued their quiet rituals. One folded his letter and tucked it carefully into his pocket, intending to send it when mail was next collected. Another leaned his head against the cold wall, closing his eyes just for a moment, chasing the faintest trace of sleep. Boots scraped softly against stone as soldiers shifted in their places, waiting, always waiting. Outside, the tide rolled steadily in, washing against the barriers and mines planted across the beaches. The sound blended with the whisper of the wind, creating a rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic. For now, it was enough to convince the men that the morning would bring nothing more than another day of tedium. And so, as dawn crept ever closer, the German soldiers remained in their bunkers, listening to the sea, blind to the truth just beyond the mist. They could not see the armada gathering in silence across the channel, nor could they imagine the thunder that would soon break the calm. For the moment, the world was still fragile in its illusion of safety, holding tightly to the last quiet hours before history changed forever. The first light of dawn spread slowly across the Norman coast, a pale gray that softened the sea and the sky into one indistinct horizon. The men inside the bunkers stirred in the half-darkness, rubbing tired eyes, adjusting belts. sipping what remained of last night's coffee. For many, it felt like any other morning. The false alarms of the night before had already been forgotten, folded into the monotony of coastal duty. But the silence broke abruptly. At first it came as a faint hum, distant and low, almost mistaken for the restless groan of the wind. Then it grew louder, deeper, filling the sky with a steady vibration that rattled helmets and echoed through the concrete walls. Heads turned upward instinctively. The sound was familiar, unmistakable. The drone of aircraft, dozens, perhaps hundreds, approaching at once. The soldiers scrambled, grabbing helmets, rifles, and field gear, rushing to the narrow slits of their bunkers. Those outside tilted their heads back, eyes widening as the sky seemed to come alive with movement. Dark shapes emerged from the mist, squadrons of planes soaring overhead in disciplined formation. Their engines roared like thunder, drowning out the sea, the gulls, and every sound of the earth below. Shouts rang out in German, urgent and overlapping. Orders were barked, though many went unheard in the noise. The men understood without words. This was no drill, no illusion of the Channel fog. Something enormous was underway. They had trained for years to repel an invasion, but no amount of training prepared them for this sight. A sky choked with wings, heavy with the promise of destruction. The first bombs fell within minutes. Explosions tore through the stillness, sending plumes of earth, sand, and smoke into the air. The ground shuddered violently beneath the soldiers' boots, dust cascading from the ceilings of bunkers. Inside the concrete walls, men clutched their rifles tightly, teeth clenched as the world outside convulsed with fire. The bunkers were built to withstand bombardment, yet even there, the shock waves rattled their bones. Along the beaches, defensive positions erupted into chaos. Machine gun nests shook as sandbags burst apart under the force of nearby blasts. Observation towers splintered under direct hits, their wooden frames collapsing into ruin. Mines buried in the dunes were accidentally detonated by falling bombs, sending secondary eruptions of fire and sand into the morning air. Confusion spread quickly. Communications faltered as wires were cut, radios hissed with static, and messages failed to reach their destinations. Officers shouted into field phones only to hear silence on the other end. Some units believed they were under isolated attack, perhaps another raid like so many that had preceded it. Others suspected something greater, though no one yet dared to voice it fully. The men themselves reacted in fragments. Some crouched low, pressing against the cold concrete walls of their shelters, whispering hurried prayers as bombs shook the earth around them. Others ran to their posts, clutching binoculars, trying desperately to see what was unfolding beyond the haze. One soldier dropped his helmet in the scramble, the metal ringing sharply against the stone floor before disappearing under a cloud of dust. Outside, the sky continued to rumble, wave after wave of aircraft sweeping overhead. Some dropped their loads upon the defenses, while others flew inland, toward roads and bridges meant to sever German reinforcements before they could reach the beaches. Fires ignited in the distance, their smoke curling upward to mingle with the mist, turning the dawn into a gray, choking veil. The illusion of safety, so carefully preserved through months of waiting, was gone. Each man felt it in his chest, the weight of inevitability pressing upon him with every fresh explosion. Whatever was happening out there on the water was no longer rumor or speculation. This was real. This was the invasion they had feared, the moment they had waited for with dread and disbelief. And yet, within the chaos, there was no time to grasp the full scale. Orders were unclear, reports fractured. Some officers shouted to hold fast, to wait in their bunkers until the shelling eased. Others demanded that machine gunners prepare their weapons, convinced that an assault on the beaches would follow. Every man acted on instinct, caught between terror and duty, clinging to the hope that the Atlantic wall would endure the storm now breaking upon it. As the bombardment raged, the German soldiers realized that the calm of the night before had been only a fragile illusion. The sky had awakened with fire and iron, and with it, the war had come crashing to their doorstep. The day they had tried not to imagine was no longer somewhere in the future. It was here. It was now. The concrete walls sweated with moisture, a thin film of dampness that made the air inside feel colder than the gray dawn outside. Soldiers huddled in their bunkers, their breaths forming faint clouds in the dim lantern light. The roar of artillery echoed through the thick walls, distant yet constant, each detonation rumbling through the floor like a low growl. Dust drifted from the ceiling with every shockwave, settling on helmets, uniforms, and rifles stacked neatly along the wall. The men sat in uneasy silence. The bombardment outside was relentless, but their orders were few and uncertain. Some were told to hold position until further command. Others received contradictory instructions: to prepare for an assault, to conserve ammunition, to remain hidden until the right moment. None of it added clarity. The wires crackled with static when officers tried to reach higher command, and field telephones lay useless, their connections cut by the bombardment. In the absence of clear direction, the soldiers did the only thing they could: they waited. Waiting inside the bunkers was its own kind of torment. The air was heavy, stale, with the mingled scents of sweat, damp stone, and gun oil. Helmets rested in laps, fingers traced nervously over the cold edges of rifles, boots shifted restlessly against the floor. A few men tried to mutter reassurances, but their words fell flat, drowned out by the thundering of distant naval guns. The steady pounding made the earth feel alive, as if the very ground beneath them were groaning under the weight of some vast storm. Now and then, the sound drew closer. A shell would strike a position nearby, rattling the bunker so violently that men flinched and ducked instinctively, though their thick walls still held. In those moments they could hear not only the explosion itself, but the cries of men outside caught in its path. For the soldiers inside, the walls were both a shield and a prison, safe for now, but blind to what was truly unfolding beyond their narrow slits. One man sat with his back pressed against the wall, eyes closed, whispering a prayer in low, steady tones. Another stared at the ceiling, lips moving silently as though rehearsing what he would say if he lived to write another letter home. The youngest among them fidgeted constantly, his leg bouncing, his breath sharp and uneven. Older comrades laid a steadying hand on his shoulder, but their own faces betrayed the same fear. The officers moved among them, their voices firm, but the firmness felt brittle, like glass that might shatter with a single crack. They repeated the same reassurances. The Atlantic wall was strong. The fortifications would hold. The Allies could not sustain an attack under such fire. Yet, even as they spoke, the bombardment grew heavier, and their words became less convincing. From time to time, someone peered through a slit in the bunker wall. The view was limited. A slice of sea, a glimpse of beach, but enough to see the chaos outside. Smoke drifted in thick black plumes, curling upward to mingle with the low clouds. The horizon flickered with flashes of fire where shells struck, followed by sprays of earth and sand. And beyond, through the haze, there were shadows, dark outlines that seemed to stretch endlessly across the water. What they were seeing, many could scarcely comprehend. Ship after ship, stretching across the channel, an armada so vast it looked as though the sea itself had been filled with steel. Landing craft bobbed in the waves, destroyers and battleships loomed in the distance, and overhead the planes still roared back and forth in endless waves. The sheer scale defied imagination. Some soldiers blinked, rubbed their eyes, convinced their vision was deceiving them. But the truth pressed down heavier than the dust in the air. This was no raid, no diversion. This was the invasion. Still, orders remained absent. The higher command had not yet acted. Rumors whispered through the ranks that Hitler was asleep, that no counterattack could be authorized without his approval. Whether true or not, the effect was the same: paralysis. The men sat in their bunkers, rifles ready, hearts pounding, but without the command to act. All they could do was wait as the bombardment pounded the world above them. Minutes stretched into hours, though none could truly measure the passage of time in the deafening chaos. Some counted the detonations, others stared blankly at their boots, each second a heavy weight pressing deeper into their nerves. The soldiers of the Atlantic Wall had spent months in boredom and routine, but now they found themselves trapped in a new torment. The endless waiting, knowing that something vast and terrible was coming, and that they were powerless to stop it. In that waiting, fear grew quietly, spreading among them like damp seeping into stone. And still, the orders did not come. The mist had clung stubbornly to the channel through the long hours of dawn, a grey veil that blurred the distance and hid what lay beyond. To the soldiers inside the bunkers, it was both a blessing and a curse. The haze shielded them from a clear view of the bombardment's source, but it also left them blind, their imaginations filling the gaps with shadows and dread. The roar of naval guns and the hum of aircraft continued without pause, a steady drumbeat of war beyond the fog. Then, slowly, the veil began to lift. It started almost imperceptibly. The sea breeze shifted, the smoke and mist drifting in broken wisps instead of a solid curtain. Pale streaks of morning light pierced through, revealing fragments of the horizon. At first it was only shapes, faint outlines, blurred silhouettes on the water. Some soldiers squinted, thinking their eyes deceived them again, the way the channel so often played tricks, but the shapes did not fade. Instead, they multiplied. One man pressed his face close to the observation slit, adjusting his binoculars with trembling fingers. What he saw froze him in place. His breath caught as the glass brought the scene into focus. Ships, not a handful, not even dozens, but hundreds. Row upon row of vessels stretched to the horizon, their dark hulls glinting in the broken light. Warships loomed larger than towns, their guns trained toward the shore. Smaller craft dotted the waves like ants upon water, thousands of them, swaying in rhythm with the tide. It was an armada of such scale that even the most hardened soldier could scarcely grasp it. Word spread quickly among the men. Those who had seen it struggled to find words, pointing instead with stiff hands, urging others to look for themselves. Soldiers pressed against the viewing slits, jostling for a glimpse. As the mist rolled back further, the enormity of the sight became undeniable. The sea itself seemed to have been remade into steel, covered with more ships than the eye could count. A heavy silence settled inside the bunkers, broken only by the distant rumble of guns. Men who had once scoffed at invasion rumors now stood in stunned disbelief. Some muttered curses under their breath, others whispered prayers, and a few simply stared, their faces drained of color. For months they had been told the Atlantic wall was impregnable, that any attempt by the Allies would be suicidal. But now, looking out at the horizon, they knew the truth. No war could hold forever against a storm like this. The officers moved briskly among them, their voices sharp, ordering calm, demanding readiness, yet even their voices carried an edge of unease. They barked instructions to check weapons, to ready ammunition, to prepare the machine guns and artillery for incoming waves. But they, too, had seen the horizon change. They, too, had felt the weight of inevitability pressing through the morning haze. Outside, the view grew clearer by the minute. The armada moved steadily forward, ships advancing like a tide that could not be stopped. The water foamed white at their bows as they cut through the channel. Plumes of smoke rose from their guns as they fired toward the shore, each blast echoing across the water. The earth shook with their rhythm, the beaches trembling with each impact. From the bunkers, the soldiers could see flashes of light erupting across the sea. Signals, gunfire, coordinated movements that spoke of planning beyond anything they had imagined. The Allies were not arriving in haste or disorder. This was a machine, vast and deliberate, each piece moving with grim precision. Shock settled into disbelief, and disbelief into a dawning sense of dread. For the men who had sat writing letters the night before, who had shuffled cards or sipped schnapps to pass the time, the contrast was almost too much to comprehend. The calm of last night felt like a dream now, fragile and far away. This morning was reality, and it was unlike anything they had known before. Some clutched their rifles tighter, knuckles white against the wood. Others adjusted their helmets, as though the simple act of preparation could steady nerves. Yet many did not move at all, transfixed by the sight, caught between the urge to fight and the inability to believe what their eyes showed them. The mist continued to peel away, revealing more with every passing moment. The horizon stretched endlessly with ships, a steel curtain drawn across the sea. The German soldiers, tucked into their bunkers and trenches, knew then that the day had come. The invasion was no longer a warning, no longer a rumor. It was here, and it had arrived with a scale beyond their imagination. Shock and disbelief settled heavily over them, pressing against their lungs like the smoke that already filled the sky. The horizon had changed, and with it, so too had their world. The morning had barely begun, yet the world outside the bunkers had transformed into a scene of relentless motion and fire. The distant hum of aircraft had been joined by a low, throbbing resonance, a sound that shook the very air like the warning pulse of some enormous, unseen creature. Then, suddenly, the naval guns opened fire. The first shells struck near the German positions, detonating in clouds of earth, sand, and smoke. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the bunkers, rattling the walls and vibrating the floor beneath the soldiers' feet. Helmets bounced on heads, rifles trembled in hands, and the very air seemed to shiver with the force of the blasts. The men pressed themselves against the stone, knuckles white, hearts hammering, clinging to the idea that their fortifications might hold. Inside the bunkers, the noise was deafening yet muffled, a distorted echo that seemed to seep into every corner. Dust fell from the ceilings in fine showers, settling on uniforms and faces, blending with sweat and grime. The smell of damp stone mixed with gun oil and smoke, creating an acrid haze that clung to the throat. Soldiers coughed quietly, some covering their mouths with the backs of their hands, while others closed their eyes and muttered prayers under their breath. Outside, the beaches were transformed. Sand erupted in geysers with every near hit, and wooden barriers splintered under the impact, Machine gun nests shook violently, forcing their operators to brace themselves to maintain aim. Mines planted along the dunes detonated in accidental synchrony with incoming shells, adding their own sudden bursts of fire and noise to the morning chaos. The sea itself seemed angry, each wave now a shadow of white and foam against the advancing Allied ships. Amid this chaos, the soldiers struggled to maintain composure. Orders from higher command were sporadic, fragmented, and often contradictory. Some officers shouted to return fire, demanding that gunners aim at the distant silhouettes on the waves. Others urged men to stay inside the bunkers, reminding them of the steel-reinforced walls designed to withstand bombardment. Confusion spread like a shadow through the ranks. Even as some attempted to fight back, the scale of the attack overwhelmed their senses. One young soldier gripped his rifle tightly, jaw set, staring at the slit in the bunker wall. He could see flashes where shells exploded near the beach, water rising in columns, and men, both German and Allied, caught in the spray of sand and debris. Fear and determination warred inside him, each breath trembling between resolve and terror. A lieutenant moved down the row of men, checking ammunition belts, encouraging those too frozen by the explosions to act. His own voice shook, despite his attempts to appear composed. Every detonation seemed closer than the last, each one a reminder that the wall they had trusted might not hold. Yet still, they held their posts, clinging to routine and training even as the reality of the bombardment pressed down like a weight upon their chests. The bunkers themselves groaned with the force of the impact. Concrete cracked in thin lines, dust falling from the ceilings in response to every shockwave. Men instinctively ducked lower, pressing their shoulders to the walls, hands over their ears to block the roar. Some whispered prayers to gods they had not thought of in months. Others murmured letters to loved ones, words of farewell whispered into the stale air. Outside, smoke began to rise in steady columns from burning bunkers, splintered gun emplacements, and ruptured barbed wire defenses. The roar of guns and the hiss of incoming shells filled the air, creating a chaotic symphony of destruction. The ground shook rhythmically with each volley, each impact a reminder of the overwhelming force now directed at their positions. Through the trembling walls the soldiers could hear the distant cries of their comrades, shouts of command, pain, fear. They held on to what they could, clutching rifles and belts of ammunition, bracing themselves against the tremors, praying that the walls would hold long enough for them to act, to survive, to see another hour. And yet, the bombardment showed no sign of slowing. It was relentless, a hammer striking again and again, as though the very sea and sky conspired to crush the defenders before the infantry even set foot on the sand. The Atlantic wall, once thought impregnable, was now tested in the harshest possible way. For the German soldiers inside their bunkers, each moment became a delicate balance between survival and despair. Even as fear tightened its grip, the men could not turn away. They remained at their posts, clinging to training and instinct, knowing that the fate of the day and perhaps the course of the war rested upon their resilience. The first bombardment had begun, and with it, the illusion of calm was shattered forever. Inside the bunkers, the rumble of artillery continued without pause, a constant reminder that the invasion was no longer a distant threat. The soldiers, their nerves already frayed from the first bombardment, now faced another challenge. The chaos of command. Communication was breaking down at every level. Telephones and wired lines had been cut or destroyed by the shelling. Radios hissed with static, and messages failed to reach their intended recipients. Field officers moved through the rows of men, shouting orders that often contradicted one another. "Hold your position," one barked, while another urged, "Prepare to fire at will." The men clutched their rifles, confused and hesitant. Which orders should they follow? Some tried to relay messages back up the chain, only to find no one on the other end, the lines dead or broken. The familiar structure of military discipline had frayed almost instantly under the weight of the bombardment. Rumors began to spread, as they always do in times of uncertainty. Whispers passed quietly from bunker to bunker that Hitler himself had not been awakened to authorize a counterattack, that the higher command was paralyzed by indecision. Some officers muttered these words aloud, half in disbelief, half as a warning. The invasion might be unstoppable because there was no one to coordinate an effective response. The men listened, hearts pounding, unsure whether to fear the enemy outside or the emptiness of command above. Even seasoned soldiers struggled to reconcile the situation. For years they had relied on orders, on the chain of command to guide them through the chaos of war. Now, the familiar certainty was gone. Decisions had to be made in the moment, often by young men barely old enough to be entrusted with life or death responsibilities. Every choice carried weight, yet every choice seemed doomed from the start. The bunkers themselves became a theater of tension. Officers moved from slit to slit, gesturing, pointing, shouting, trying to coordinate a defense, but their voices were often lost amid the pounding shells and roaring aircraft. Men strained to follow instructions, to position themselves at machine guns, to load artillery, but the scale of the attack and the disjointed orders made each action feel almost futile. One lieutenant, his uniform dusty and sweat-streaked, attempted to rally his men by calling out targets and priorities. "Concentrate on the landing craft. Hold the left flank," he shouted. But as he looked outward, he realized that each moment the enemy seemed to advance with unstoppable precision. His own words, though firm, carried little weight against the vast armada spreading across the horizon. Meanwhile, rumors and panic interwove with official instructions. A soldier whispered to his comrade that reinforcements would never arrive, that the enemy had achieved total surprise. Another claimed that a command post had already been destroyed by artillery. The line between truth and fear blurred, leaving men to navigate a battlefield that was as much psychological as it was physical. Some tried to anchor themselves in training. They counted rounds, checked ammunition, belts, and verified weapon functionality, clinging to the routines that had sustained them through other crises. Yet no drill could prepare them for the realization that their superiors were incapacitated, that the meticulous planning they had relied on for months might be rendered meaningless by absence or indecision. In quieter corners of the bunkers, older soldiers muttered to themselves, reciting familiar phrases and prayers. They remembered previous campaigns, the strict discipline of orders given and followed, and how those structures had once provided a sense of safety. Now that security was gone, replaced by the uncertain authority of men scrambling to maintain control amidst chaos. The confusion above filtered down like smoke. Every order came with hesitation. Every command carried uncertainty. The soldiers could hear the fear behind the shouts, the uncertainty that no training could hide. And outside, beyond the bunkers, the assault pressed on relentlessly. Ships advanced, planes roared, shells rained down, and the horizon itself seemed to close in. In this liminal space, trapped between the order they had once known and the chaos they could not escape, the German soldiers understood that the coming hours would test them not only physically, but mentally and emotionally. Without clear leadership, the Atlantic Wall would have to hold on the strength of individual resolve, courage, and sheer determination, each man acting as both soldier and decision-maker in a battle that had already begun to overwhelm the old structures of command. Even as fear grew, the men remained at their posts. They prepared rifles, loaded machine guns, and braced themselves for the inevitable contact with the enemy. Orders might be unclear, command might be paralyzed, but they were soldiers, and for now, they would hold. The day was far from over, and the horizon, slowly clearing from mist to reveal the vast invasion fleet, demanded their full attention. The horizon, once a distant mystery, now revealed its terrible truth through drifting smoke, whirls of sand, and the lingering mist of early morning. The German soldiers could make out the first of the Allied landing craft, tiny at first, then growing larger with every second. The vessels bobbed in the waves, their engines churning the water into frothy trails. From the bunkers, men squinted through observation slits, some pressing binoculars to their eyes, others gripping rifles, hearts hammering as the invasion finally came into focus. Machine gun crews scrambled to their positions, belts of ammunition were checked with trembling fingers, weapons racked and cocked, barrels glinting dimly in the smoke-filtered light. The deafening hum of aircraft above blended with the roar of naval bombardment, creating a chaotic symphony of sound that pressed down on every man. Explosions shook the ground in a continuous rhythm, dust and debris falling from the ceilings of the bunkers like a slow rain of stone. The soldiers could see the landing craft approach the beaches, each vessel carrying soldiers intent on breaching the Atlantic Wall. The craft rose and fell on the waves, their hulls dark against the foam, tiny in the vastness of the sea, yet massive in the terror they carried. Men on the German side felt their stomachs twist as they realized the sheer number of troops advancing toward them, thousands, well-trained and coordinated, prepared to storm the shore despite the hail of shells and gunfire. Chaos erupted on the beach. Explosions from the earlier bombardment mixed with new detonations from mines and artillery, sending plumes of sand into the air. Smoke curled upward, thickening the dawn light into a gray haze. The smell of gunpowder and cordite reached even the bunkers, mingling with the salt of the sea and the acrid temps of burning wood and concrete. Every sound seemed amplified. The thunder of shells, the clatter of metal, the shouts of soldiers both attacking and defending. For the men in the bunkers, the first shots from machine guns rang out almost instinctively. Some fired blindly into the haze, aiming at the shapes they could barely see. Others followed orders, tracking landing craft as they crept closer to the sand. Each pull of the trigger carried the weight of months of preparation. Every bullet fired a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. The officers shouted commands through the din, voices raw with tension. Left flank, focus fire, don't let them reach the obstacles. Their words cut through the chaos, but the scale of the invasion rendered precise coordination nearly impossible. Some men obeyed instantly. Others froze, overwhelmed by the mixture of fear, disbelief, and adrenaline. The bunkers trembled with each nearby impact. Every explosion, a reminder that no position was entirely safe. From the observation slits, the soldiers could see the first waves of men disembarking from the landing craft. Helmets glinted in the smoke, rifles raised as the troops pressed forward through the surf, splashing through the water under a hail of German fire. The beach, once a strip of sand and dunes, became a war zone, transformed by smoke, fire, and the relentless advance of the enemy. The scale of the assault was staggering. Boats continued to arrive in sequence, never-ending waves, the sheer magnitude testing the endurance of every man defending the coast. Some soldiers, gripping their rifles, could hardly comprehend how so many could cross the channel, yet they acted as they had trained, focusing on their sector, aiming, firing, and reloading as the chaos raged around them. Inside the bunkers, fear mingled with resolve. Each man understood the stakes: hold the line, delay the enemy, survive if possible. They pressed themselves against walls, tracking targets, muttering short prayers, or recalling letters from home in an attempt to steady their nerves. Outside, the roar of guns and the hiss of incoming shells blended into a constant, overwhelming rhythm. The sound of the invasion in full motion. As the first landing craft touched sand, men were already fighting in the surf. Machine guns spat fire, rifles cracked, and the coordinated advance of the Allied troops pressed relentlessly against the German defenses. The bunkers, solid and imposing, offered some protection, but they were not impregnable. The soldiers inside knew that the battle had truly begun, and that every decision, every shot, and every second could mean the difference between life and death. Amid the chaos, time seemed to stretch, each moment heavy with anticipation and dread. The horizon, once distant, had brought the enemy to their doorstep. The landings had begun, and with them, the Atlantic Wall faced the greatest assault of its existence. The soldiers braced, fired, and waited, each aware that history was unfolding before their eyes, even as survival demanded their complete focus. From the bunkers perched atop the cliffs, the German gunners finally had a clear line of sight. The horizon, once shrouded in mist, now revealed the full extent of the assault. Landing craft crowded with Allied soldiers, advancing through the surf and toward the jagged obstacles dotting the beaches. The defenders knew the beaches had been carefully prepared. Mines buried under the sand, barbed wire stretching in intricate patterns, wooden stakes planted to cripple landing craft. Yet seeing the relentless waves of men approach made every defensive measure feel simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. The gunners worked with precision, their hands steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Machine guns rattled and spat fire across the sand, each burst cutting through the haze and smoke. The air trembled with the roar of rifles, the whistling of incoming shells, and the splintering of obstacles under fire. Explosions from mines detonated in sudden columns of sand and water, tossing men into the surf or knocking them back into the waves. The German soldiers on the cliffs could see the immediate results of their fire, yet, even as bodies fell, the attackers pressed forward, relentless in their advance. Every shot fired demanded focus. One gunner adjusted his sights carefully, taking aim at groups of men moving through the water, while his comrade beside him loaded belt after belt of ammunition, readying the next burst. Their teamwork was essential, every fraction of a second counted. Despite the bombardment, the Allies continued to surge forward, each wave driven by training, determination, and the knowledge that the defenders would not yield easily. The smoke and debris from nearby shelling made visibility challenging. Sand hung in the air like mist, obscuring some targets while leaving others in sharp relief. Yet, even in the chaos, the German soldiers maintained discipline, calculating the timing of bursts to maximize coverage of the advancing troops. They aimed not only at the soldiers but at the landing craft themselves, attempting to stall the tide before it reached the obstacles. The scene on the beaches was devastating. Bodies fell into the surf, weapons clattered to the sand, and screams carried faintly up to the cliffs. Some landing craft were destroyed outright, capsizing under concentrated fire. Others made it closer, only to be halted by obstacles or mines hidden beneath the waves. The attackers were brave, skilled, and coordinated, but the German positions inflicted as much damage as they could, each volley a desperate attempt to hold the line. Even as the gunners fired relentlessly, the physical and emotional toll weighed heavily. Hands ached from reloading, eyes strained to track targets through smoke and sand, and ears rang from the constant roar of the guns and the thundering impact of shells. Men whispered quick prayers under their breath, seeking protection or strength to continue. Each body fallen on the beach was a reminder of the stakes, and the relentless advance of the enemy made clear that this was only the beginning of a long, harrowing morning. Commanders moved along the cliff tops, shouting instructions, signaling which sectors to cover, adjusting firing angles, and ensuring that every gun remained manned. Their faces were taut with tension, eyes scanning the beach, noting where fire had been most effective and where gaps in the defense might allow the attackers to press forward. Every decision was critical. A single lapse could open the beach to a surge of men that no fortification could contain. Despite the devastating fire, waves of Allied soldiers continued to advance. They pushed through the surf, struggling against the water, the sand, and the relentless hail of bullets. Some fell, only to be replaced by comrades pressing on, determined to overcome every obstacle. The German soldiers could see the courage, the sheer persistence, and the human will driving the assault, and it was enough to unsettle even the most experienced defenders. From the bunkers and cliff-top positions, the Germans watched as their training and fortifications inflicted heavy casualties, yet failed to stop the flow entirely. Fear mixed with exhaustion, adrenaline with disbelief, as each man realized that the scale of the invasion might exceed what any single defensive position could resist. Still, they fought. They fired. They held their posts, even as the waves of attackers seemed endless. The morning continued in a haze of smoke, sand, and fire. The beaches were transformed into a battlefield where every foot of sand had to be contested, where every moment of pause could spell disaster. The German gunners, perched above, unleashed devastation with precision, yet the relentless determination of the enemy ensured that no position was safe. No wave could be fully stopped, and no one on the cliffs could afford to falter. And so the fire from the cliffs raged on, a desperate, calculated barrage against an enemy that refused to retreat, signaling that the battle for the beaches had truly begun in full measure. The relentless bombardment and assault began to take a brutal toll on the German positions. Bunkers that had once seemed impervious now trembled with every nearby shell, cracks forming in concrete walls that had been reinforced to withstand months of preparation. Dust and debris filled the air, settling on uniforms, weapons, and faces, mixing with sweat and the acrid scent of smoke. For the soldiers inside, the illusion of security shattered with each violent tremor. Outside, the beaches were no longer distant. Waves of Allied soldiers had reached the obstacles, working tirelessly to breach mines, barbed wire, and wooden stakes. The gunners on the cliffs fired relentlessly, but even their devastating fire could not stop the attackers from pressing forward. In many sectors, the first waves made it to the sand, scrambling over defenses, and engaging with the German infantry in terrifying close combat. Some bunkers, once central to defensive strategy, were overrun. Explosions tore through walls, artillery rounds struck directly, and breaches were made in positions that had been thought secure. Soldiers scrambled to respond, clutching rifles and hand grenades, shouting instructions over the deafening noise. Fear mixed with adrenaline as men realized that every second could be their last. The calm, distant observations of the morning were replaced by immediate, pressing danger. The German soldiers faced the reality they had feared for months. The invasion was not abstract. It was here, tangible, violent, and personal. Combat was no longer from a distance. Hands met hands, rifles clashed, and the sound of bullets striking bodies became as close as the walls around them. Some men fired from bunkers, others ran into the open to confront the attackers, each movement calculated but driven by survival instinct. Amid the chaos, exhaustion began to show. Soldiers' arms ached from holding rifles, fingers numbed from reloading belts, and legs trembled under the strain of standing, crouching, or running across sand and rubble. Even the youngest, most trained men felt the weight of hours of relentless combat pressing down. The psychological strain, the terror of collapse, the screams of comrades, The overwhelming noise compounded the physical burden. Officers tried desperately to maintain order, rallying men wherever possible, but the scale of the assault made command almost impossible. Orders were shouted, repeated, and sometimes ignored. As each soldier's immediate focus narrowed to the threat directly in front of him, the battlefield became a patchwork of small skirmishes. One bunker held against waves of attackers while another felt men fighting with rifles, grenades, and sheer determination. The ground shook under artillery, mines detonated unpredictably, and smoke from fires obscured visibility. Soldiers in forward positions moved cautiously, trying to anticipate attacks, while those trapped inside damaged bunkers prayed that walls would hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Though they knew in their hearts that help might never come, each breath was heavy, each heartbeat a reminder of the danger surrounding them. Despite the chaos, German soldiers acted with training and discipline where they could. Machine guns were manned with relentless determination, rifles fired in controlled bursts, and grenades were lobbed at approaching troops with grim precision. Yet the relentless pressure of the Allied assault meant that no position could remain unchallenged for long. Each defensive measure exacted a toll, yet no matter the damage inflicted, the enemy advanced, wave after wave. In the bunkers, men could feel walls flex under the impact of artillery. Dust cascaded like a thin rain, coating hair, skin, and uniforms. The air grew heavier with smoke and heat from fires that spread from destroyed obstacles and wooden barricades. Shouts, screams, and gunfire blended into an almost continuous roar that pressed on the mind, challenging every thought of composure. Close combat became unavoidable. Soldiers faced attackers mere meters away, exchanging fire and fighting hand-to-hand where bullets ran out or obstacles were breached. The theoretical distance of battle had vanished. The war was immediate, physical, and terrifying. Every movement was measured against the odds of survival, every decision could mean life or death, and every breath carried the weight of uncertainty. By mid-morning, it became clear that the day would not yield easily to the defenders. Some bunkers held, others fell. But all soldiers understood the same stark reality. The invasion had reached a breaking point in their defenses, and the true test of courage, endurance, and survival had begun in earnest. Amid smoke, fire, and sand, each man grappled with the terrifying immediacy of war, and the knowledge that the Atlantic wall might not withstand the storm that had arrived on the beaches. By late morning, the beaches had become unrecognizable. Smoke from burning obstacles and exploding shells mingled with the scent of gunpowder and salt water, creating a haze so thick that visibility beyond a few meters was nearly impossible. The rhythmic pounding of artillery, once distant, now echoed across every dune and bunker, mixing with the relentless whine of incoming fire and the shouts of men engaged in desperate combat. Sand churned beneath the feet of attackers and defenders alike, stained with blood and dotted with the wreckage of landing craft, rifles, and broken helmets. German defenders clung to their positions as best they could. Some fired from partially collapsed bunkers, the walls barely shielding them from bullets and shrapnel. Machine gun crews alternated between controlled bursts and frenzied volleys, each shot aimed at slowing the relentless advance of Allied troops. Every man knew the beaches had been meticulously prepared, mines, barbed wire, wooden obstacles, but even the best-laid defenses could not stop the sheer weight of soldiers pressing forward. Close combat erupted in small pockets along the sand. Soldiers grappled with attackers who had breached obstacles, exchanging rifle strikes, bayonet thrusts, and hand-to-hand blows. Dust and smoke clung to sweat-slicked uniforms, making every motion heavy. The cries of the wounded mingled with the roar of guns, creating a grim symphony of war that pressed into every corner of the defenders' consciousness. Officers struggled to maintain cohesion. Orders were shouted above the din. Hold the center, flank the left, fall back to secondary positions. Yet the messages often reached only half of the men or were drowned out by explosions and gunfire. Some units were forced to improvise, relying on instinct and training as chaos spread through the ranks. In certain bunkers, men moved in coordinated bursts, handing ammunition and rotating gun positions to maintain pressure. But the relentless tide of attackers made each action a temporary reprieve at best. The Allies pressed forward with determination. Landing craft had reached the dunes, and troops now surged through the sand, cutting paths through obstacles while under constant fire. Some fell, others stumbled yet rose again, pressing onward with a discipline that made the German defenders' task feel almost impossible. The sheer numbers of soldiers, coupled with coordination across multiple beach sectors, overwhelmed isolated pockets of resistance. Amid the sand and smoke, the landscape was littered with casualties on both sides. Helmets were overturned, rifles abandoned, and small fires from burning wood and fuel spilled onto the sand. The air carried a metallic temps of blood mixed with smoke, every breath thick and difficult to take. Soldiers on both sides moved through this chaos with a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and grim determination. German infantrymen trained for defense found themselves reacting in ways they had never imagined. Some retreated to secondary lines when positions were overrun. Others took up new firing points in shell craters or behind debris, and a few attempted counterattacks in small groups, hoping to reclaim lost ground. The ebb and flow of the battle created a sense of disorientation, one moment holding firm, the next forced back, the line constantly shifting under the weight of incoming soldiers. The bunkers, many damaged or partially destroyed, offered limited protection. Soldiers inside pressed their bodies against the walls, using narrow slits to fire while avoiding the storm of bullets and shrapnel. Dust fell like snow from cracked ceilings, and the metallic taste of powder filled their mouths. Every heartbeat was accompanied by the roar of guns, the screech of shells, and the screams of the wounded. From the cliffs above, gunners continued their relentless fire, but even their devastating accuracy could not stop the determined push of the Allies. Every volley slowed the attackers, but waves continued to reach the dunes, disembarking troops ready to fight for every meter of sand. German soldiers witnessed this with a mixture of awe, disbelief, and fear. The human will to advance seemed almost unstoppable. As the day progressed, German positions became increasingly tenuous. Small groups were isolated, surrounded by advancing troops, forced to fight on multiple fronts at once. Communication remained fractured, reinforcements were delayed or destroyed, and the psychological weight of relentless pressure pressed on every man. Each moment became a test of endurance, courage, and survival. As the defenders realized that holding the beaches was only part of the struggle, survival beyond them would require even greater resolve. Amid the smoke, sand, and blood, the German defenders fought desperately, doing everything within their power to slow the tide of attackers. The beaches had become a crucible of human endurance and warfare, where every second was measured against life and death, and every action carried consequences that would echo through the rest of the day. By midday, the one solid line of German defenses along the beaches had begun to fracture. Communication was nearly non-existent. Phones were cut, radios hissed with static, and runners carrying orders were caught in crossfire or swept away by artillery. Officers shouted over the roar of guns, but the words rarely reached all of the men, leaving small groups of soldiers to act on their own judgment. Each man became both fighter and decision-maker, navigating chaos that no training could fully prepare them for. These isolated pockets clung desperately to positions that were no longer contiguous. Machine gun nests operated autonomously. Riflemen held corners of bunkers that had been partially destroyed, and squads attempted to coordinate by shouting across sand and smoke, hoping someone would hear. Each position was a tiny bastion against a tide that refused to stop. The beaches had become a battlefield of fragments, where soldiers fought in almost complete isolation, relying on instinct and discipline to survive. The advancing Allied soldiers pressed relentlessly forward. Waves of infantry crossed the sand, making use of cover wherever possible, and quickly adapted to the German fire. They moved with grim determination, overcoming mines and obstacles, and occupying every meter of sand that the defenders could not hold. From the partially collapsed bunkers, the German soldiers watched in disbelief and frustration as their careful preparations were systematically undermined. Fear mingled with exhaustion. Men's arms trembled from firing, backs ached from crouching behind makeshift cover, and throats burned from shouting orders or curses. The noise was almost unbearable. The roar of artillery, the crack of rifles, the whine of incoming shells, and the screams of the wounded blended into a constant, oppressive symphony. Yet, amidst the chaos, soldiers continued to act. Training and survival instincts guided each decision, each movement, and each shot fired into the advancing tide. In some places, small groups of defenders found temporary success. A well-placed burst from a machine gun nest could halt an entire squad for moments, buying precious seconds. Grenades hurled into clusters of attackers slowed their advance, and determined riflemen could inflict casualties even under overwhelming odds. Yet for every success, the attackers adapted, moving around obstacles, coordinating with reinforcements, and pressing on relentlessly. Each temporary victory was bittersweet, a fleeting respite in a struggle that seemed endless. Reinforcements were a distant hope, often imagined rather than real. Soldiers shouted to see if anyone was coming to support them, but no answers came. The isolation weighed heavily. Some men fought side by side with comrades they had known for months. Others found themselves alone, grappling with fear and adrenaline in equal measure. Each moment of survival became intensely personal, a test of endurance and mental fortitude. The terrain offered little advantage. Sand shifted underfoot, dunes offered minimal cover, and smoke from burning obstacles obscured sightlines. Men had to adjust constantly, moving from shallow craters to splintered bunkers, from dune to damaged obstacle, while remaining aware of bullets, shells, and the relentless movement of enemy troops. Coordination with other positions was almost impossible, leaving each group to fight for survival independently. Despite the overwhelming pressure, the German soldiers fought with grim determination. Each wave of attackers slowed their advance through disciplined fire, quick repositioning, and improvised traps where possible. Every action was deliberate, every second gained was precious. The struggle was exhausting, both physically and mentally, yet retreat was not an option. They clung to the beaches with the knowledge that the failure of one small sector could compromise the entire defensive line. The morning had evolved into a relentless ordeal. Noise, smoke, and blood filled every sense. Soldiers could see comrades fall only to be replaced by fresh attackers pressing from the surf. Survival depended on focus, courage, and the ability to adapt in real time to a battle that no one man or officer could fully control. As the hours passed, German positions became ever more tenuous. Small groups continued to resist, fighting with the tenacity of men who understood both the enormity of the invasion and the fragility of their defenses. Each action, each volley of fire, each moment of resistance was a testament to endurance, even as the tide of attackers seemed unending. The struggle for the beaches was no longer a battle fought in unison. It had become a mosaic of isolated conflicts, each soldier facing the immense challenge of survival in chaos. By midday, the grim reality was undeniable. The invasion was larger than anything the German defenders had imagined. Waves of Allied soldiers continued to pour onto the beaches, their advance relentless, their numbers staggering. From the bunkers and clifftop positions, the defenders could see the full scope of the assault. Landing craft lined the horizon. Small arms fire erupted across every dune, and smoke from burning obstacles and destroyed positions stretched into the sky like a grey curtain. The initial confidence of the morning had eroded. The bunkers, once believed to be impregnable, had been damaged or overrun in several sectors. Obstacles designed to delay the attackers were cleared or destroyed, and the small groups of German soldiers were increasingly isolated, forced to fight alone or in ad hoc units. Communication had broken down entirely in some areas, leaving men uncertain of orders, reinforcements, or even the broader status of the battlefield. Fear and disbelief mingled with the fog of battle. Soldiers watched as wave after wave of attackers surged forward, adapting to defensive fire and pressing through obstacles with determination. Mines exploded underfoot, sending geysers of sand into the air, while machine guns attempted to mow down advancing troops. Yet for every man felled, others replaced him, advancing steadily toward the defensive lines. The sheer scale and coordination of the invasion was overwhelming, and even the most seasoned German soldiers began to question whether their positions could hold. Officers attempted to organize countermeasures, shouting orders that sometimes reached only a handful of men. Hold the center, protect the flanks. Their voices carried urgency, but in many cases, they were drowned out by the constant roar of artillery, gunfire, and explosions. Units moved independently, improvising where coordination had failed. Some launched brief counterattacks, attempting to reclaim lost sections of sand or obstacles, while others fell back to secondary positions, trying to regroup before being forced further inland. The defenders' physical and mental exhaustion grew. Hours of continuous combat, under constant bombardment and fire, had taken their toll. Hands ached from gripping rifles, shoulders burned from carrying equipment, and legs trembled from crouching, running, or bracing against walls. Yet despite the fatigue, men fought on, driven by training, fear, and the instinct to survive. Every shot fired, every step forward or backward, every grenade thrown was an act of defiance against the unstoppable tide pressing upon them. The beaches themselves had become a chaotic battlefield. Sand was churned into a muddy, blood-stained terrain. Smoke and dust reduced visibility, and the sound of continuous artillery and rifle fire created a deafening environment. The landscape had been transformed into a nightmarish scene of destruction, where every dune, obstacle, and bunker was contested fiercely. Amid this chaos, German soldiers faced the sobering truth. Their defenses, however well prepared, were beginning to fail. Bunkers crumbled under artillery, machine gun nests were destroyed or abandoned, and isolated groups of defenders were being surrounded. Even in sectors that had held firm in the morning, the relentless pressure of the attackers threatened to break through, forcing soldiers into constant movement, improvisation, and improvisational combat. The psychological strain was immense. Men watched comrades fall, observed the determination of the enemy, and realized that the invasion's scale was beyond anything they had been prepared for. Panic threatened to spread, but discipline, training, and sheer survival instinct held many in place. Every moment required focus, every decision carried weight, and every misstep could result in death. By midday it was clear that the tide of battle had shifted. The German defenders, though brave and trained, faced the overwhelming might of an invasion that was methodical, coordinated, and relentless. The Atlantic Wall, for all its preparation and fortification, was under siege from forces that could not easily be stopped. Resistance continued, but the reality was stark. The defenders were on the brink, and the beaches they had sworn to hold were slowly being consumed by the unstoppable advance of the Allied troops. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the grim choices facing the German soldiers became increasingly clear. The beaches were no longer continuous defensive lines, but a patchwork of isolated positions. Some still holding, others breached or destroyed. Smoke curled into the sky from wrecked landing craft, burning obstacles, and shattered bunkers, while the roar of gunfire, artillery, and explosions filled every corner of the battlefield. Amid this chaos, officers and enlisted men alike confronted an impossible dilemma: retreat, surrender, or fight to the death. Some units, realizing the untenable nature of their positions, began a cautious withdrawal. Orders, often fragmented or non-existent, were replaced by instinct. Soldiers moved from one sand-covered crater or damaged bunker to another, attempting to regroup or find secondary defensive positions. The retreat was fraught with peril. Open stretches of sand offered no cover, and every step forward toward safety exposed men to enemy fire. Those attempting to withdraw quickly discovered that moving alone or in small groups was often the only way to survive. Yet the cost was high. Other units, however, refused to yield. Some soldiers clung to their positions with stubborn resolve, motivated by a combination of training, fear, pride, and sheer defiance. Machine gun nests continued to fire, rifles cracked in disciplined bursts, and grenades were hurled at the advancing soldiers in desperate attempts to slow the tide. These defenders were fully aware that their positions might be overrun at any moment, yet their will to resist held them in place, a last line of defense against the relentless invasion. The decisions were not only tactical but deeply personal. Soldiers weighed the consequences of surrender against the shame or fear it carried. Retreat offered the slim hope of survival, but came with the constant risk of being cut down in the open. Fighting to the death promised a final assertion of control, a way to leave the battlefield with dignity, but it also carried almost certain death. Each man's choice was dictated by a mixture of circumstance, instinct, and the overwhelming pressure of the situation. Confusion and fear ran rampant in many sectors. Groups that had once fought in unison now acted independently, improvising in the face of overwhelming enemy numbers. Communication remained fractured, and reinforcements were rare or non-existent. Some soldiers shouted to one another, trying to coordinate movements or cover each other's retreat, while others acted silently, moving cautiously between craters and debris to avoid drawing attention. Amid the chaos, small pockets of determined defenders inflicted significant damage on the attackers. Every burst from a machine gun, every grenade thrown, slowed the advance and forced the Allies to adapt. Yet even these heroic actions could not stem the tide indefinitely. Waves of soldiers pressed forward, moving relentlessly across the beaches, overcoming obstacles, and gradually eroding the German positions. The psychological strain on the defenders was immense. Exhaustion set in, combined with the constant threat of death. Soldiers could feel the weight of every choice, every action, and every moment of hesitation. Retreating units feared exposure and isolation, while those holding their ground confronted the growing likelihood that their positions would eventually be overrun. Fear, adrenaline, and grim determination blended into an almost tangible fog of tension that pressed on the mind as much as the body. In some cases, surrender became a reluctant necessity. Soldiers, trapped or outnumbered, raised their hands in the hope of survival. Others, witnessing comrades captured or killed, resolved to fight to the last. The beach had become a crucible of choice and consequence, where the scale of the invasion rendered many options perilous, and yet decisions had to be made in the split-second immediacy of combat. Even as units fell back or stood their ground, the battlefield itself seemed to shift beneath their feet. Smoke obscured landmarks, explosions reshaped terrain, and the relentless advance of enemy troops created a sense of unpredictability that forced soldiers to act instinctively, relying on training and gut instinct to navigate the chaos. Each choice carried risk, yet inaction was often deadlier than action. By late afternoon, the stark reality was undeniable. Some German soldiers would survive only by retreating, others by holding their positions to the bitter end. The beaches were no longer a continuous line of defense but a mosaic of desperate resistance, punctuated by heroism, fear, and tragic loss. The struggle demanded decisions of the most extreme nature, and each man faced them alone, under fire, and under the shadow of overwhelming odds. The beaches, once the focus of defense, had become a scene of devastation and retreat. For German soldiers who survived the relentless assault, the next challenge awaited beyond the sand and dunes. The Norman countryside, a maze of hedgerows, narrow lanes, and hidden obstacles. Retreating units moved cautiously, exhausted, and fearful, aware that the enemy had not only taken the beaches, but was now extending its control inland with meticulous coordination. The countryside, with its dense hedgerows and winding roads, offered both concealment and danger. German soldiers hoped to find temporary refuge behind tall hedges or in farm buildings, only to discover that the Allies had anticipated their movements. Paratroopers dropped behind the lines in the early hours of the invasion, now cut off roads, set up ambushes, and disrupted any attempts to regroup. Small convoys moving along country lanes were met with sudden fire from concealed positions, forcing retreating soldiers to scatter or risk annihilation. The terrain itself was exhausting. Narrow lanes restricted movement for vehicles and artillery. Hedgerows forced men to move in tight formations, and the rolling fields made it difficult to spot enemy forces until they were dangerously close. Every step had to be calculated, every sound analyzed for potential threats. Soldiers had to adapt from the static defense of bunkers and cliffs to a mobile, fluid form of combat where ambushes could appear from any direction. Groups that had retreated together often found themselves separated. Some squads became isolated, forced to navigate unfamiliar terrain while under threat of enemy patrols. Communication remained nearly impossible. Radios had been lost or destroyed, runners were killed or delayed, and the chaos of battle had already fragmented units. Men relied on maps, instinct, and cautious observation, constantly scanning hedgerows for signs of ambush or movement. The psychological strain intensified. After hours of beach combat, soldiers now faced the uncertainty of an environment where danger could come from any direction. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves, every shadow along the hedgerows raised immediate alarm. Sleep deprivation, hunger, and fatigue compounded the stress, making each encounter a test not only of physical skill but mental endurance. Ambushes were swift and deadly. Allied paratroopers trained for surprise attacks struck suddenly from concealed positions. Machine guns rattled, rifles cracked, and grenades exploded in tight formations, forcing German soldiers to dive for cover, scatter, or return fire with whatever weapons remained. Every retreating unit had to fight a dual battle, advancing cautiously to safety while defending against unpredictable strikes that could appear anywhere along the countryside lanes. Some units attempted to regroup in small farmyards or abandoned buildings. These temporary strongpoints offered a brief respite, a chance to reorganize and tend to the wounded. Yet such places were quickly identified by enemy scouts or artillery observers. The illusion of safety was fleeting, and soldiers learned that even behind walls, hedges, or fences, the risk of sudden attack remained high. Mines and improvised defenses became essential for slowing the enemy's pursuit. Retreating units placed explosives in roads, overturned carts to block lanes, and used the natural features of the countryside to their advantage. Yet these measures could only delay the inevitable. The scale of the Allied advance meant that, no matter how well a position was fortified or concealed, pressure was constant, relentless, and increasingly suffocating. The retreat into the countryside marked a shift from organized defense to survival-driven engagement. Soldiers had to make split-second decisions, advance through open fields or risk ambush along narrow lanes, engage attackers directly or attempt to evade them, help wounded comrades, or move forward to avoid capture. Each choice carried life or death consequences, and hesitation could prove fatal. As evening approached, shadows lengthened across the fields and hedgerows. The retreating German soldiers moved cautiously, aware that every sound, every movement, could signify enemy presence. The landscape, once a familiar home terrain, had become a labyrinth of danger. The invasion was no longer confined to the beaches. It had extended into the heart of Normandy, and the defenders were forced to adapt, survive, and fight under conditions far removed from the structured defenses they had relied upon. The hedgerows became both shield and snare, offering concealment while simultaneously concealing threats. Every soldier who had survived the beaches now faced the realization that the struggle was far from over. The tide of battle had shifted inland, and the war would demand constant vigilance, rapid decisions, and the endurance to navigate a countryside turned into a deadly battlefield. By mid-afternoon, the full scale of the devastation became painfully clear. The Atlantic Wall, long touted as an impregnable fortress, was failing before the eyes of the German defenders. Bunkers that had once seemed invincible now lay in ruins, shattered by precise naval bombardments or captured by waves of advancing soldiers. The carefully constructed obstacles, barbed wire, mines, wooden stakes, had slowed the attackers only temporarily. The massive invasion, meticulously planned and executed, was overwhelming every defensive measure in place. From the clifftop positions, soldiers could see strongpoints falling one after another. Explosions ripped apart walls, smoke rose from damaged bunkers, and the cries of men trapped inside carried faintly through the haze. Some defenders had been cut down in their positions, others captured, while small groups attempted last-ditch resistance amidst the rubble. The scale of loss was staggering, and the psychological blow struck as deeply as the physical destruction. Those who remained in defensive positions grappled with a sense of helplessness. They had trained, fortified, and prepared, yet the reality of the invasion defied expectation. Every wave of attackers seemed larger than the last, and each position lost was another step toward the complete collapse of the Atlantic Wall. Orders from higher command were sporadic, often contradictory, or entirely absent, leaving soldiers to act independently in a chaotic battlefield. Even the most experienced officers struggled to maintain cohesion. Signals from distant sectors were lost in the roar of artillery, radios failed, and runners were delayed or killed. Units became isolated, forced to make rapid autonomous decisions about whether to hold, retreat, or risk counterattacks. Many chose to remain at their posts, clinging to the hope that resistance could slow the enemy, if not stop them entirely. The defenders' efforts, while courageous, could not stem the tide. Machine guns, rifles, and grenades inflicted casualties, yet the sheer numbers and coordination of the Allied forces ensured that every strongpoint was eventually compromised. Explosions tore apart bunkers, artillery fire flattened obstacles, and infantry surged past even the most determined resistance. The Atlantic Wall, symbolic of German engineering and strategic planning, was proving fragile against the overwhelming force bearing down upon it. From the beaches, the collapse was both tactical and psychological. Men who had fought fiercely throughout the morning and early afternoon now watched comrades fall, positions crumble, and the coastline become increasingly dominated by the invaders. Fear and exhaustion intertwined, creating a suffocating weight on every soldier's mind and body. Survival demanded quick thinking, adaptability, and the grim acceptance that the fortress they had trusted was no longer a safe haven. Retreat became inevitable for many. Units that had held out as long as possible began to withdraw toward secondary positions or into the countryside, seeking cover and regrouping opportunities. Others attempted desperate countermeasures, firing from wrecked bunkers or setting off explosives to slow the attackers. Yet the collapse was inexorable. Every hour brought further gains for the Allies and further losses for the defenders. Amid the smoke, sand, and debris, soldiers faced the stark reality of war. Training, preparation, and morale had their limits. And the Atlantic Wall, once a symbol of invincibility, was now a series of shattered positions, each telling the story of courage, resistance, and eventual defeat. Those who survived carried the weight of witnessing the unraveling of what had been considered unassailable, a memory that would haunt them long after the battle had moved inland. As the sun began its slow descent, the remaining defenders recognized a harsh truth. The Atlantic Wall had not only failed to stop the invasion, it had been penetrated and dismantled, one strongpoint at a time. Every bunker that fell, every position overrun, confirmed that the tide had irrevocably turned. The beachhead was lost, and the survivors faced the next phase of battle, a retreat into the hedgerows, a desperate struggle to regroup, and the grim challenge of surviving an invasion that had shattered even the strongest defenses. As evening descended on the beaches of Normandy, the German defenders were a picture of exhaustion and despair. Hours of relentless combat had taken a brutal toll on bodies and minds alike. Arms trembled from the constant strain of firing rifles and manning. Machine guns' legs ached from crouching, running, and scrambling over sand and debris, and every breath seemed heavier than the last, thick with smoke, salt, and the metallic temps of blood. Fatigue was everywhere, pressing down on every soldier like a tangible weight. Ammunition was dangerously low in many positions. Men frantically counted remaining rounds, sharing what little they had with comrades, improvising reloads, or using grenades sparingly. The endless waves of attackers had stretched supplies beyond the point of sustainability, leaving defenders with only the barest hope of holding out. Even the strongest positions were no longer sustainable under such pressure, and the physical limitations of exhaustion combined with the depletion of resources to create a desperate situation. The chaos of the battlefield amplified the psychological strain. Communication had all but collapsed. Orders from higher command were rare, contradictory, or completely absent. Soldiers were left to act on instinct, trying to anticipate enemy movements, coordinate with isolated comrades, and maintain defensive lines that were rapidly disintegrating. Fear, adrenaline, and confusion intermingled, creating a mental fog that clouded judgment and intensified the sense of helplessness. Many felt abandoned by their command. Reports of reinforcements arriving never materialized, messages went unanswered, and the grand strategies they had been trained to follow seemed irrelevant against the overwhelming scale of the invasion. Officers struggled to maintain authority as isolated units faced impossible odds. Morale, once a pillar of their strength, faltered under the weight of relentless assault, casualties, and the undeniable reality that the Atlantic Wall had failed. The landscape itself reflected the despair. Sand was churned into a muddy, blood-stained terrain, littered with wrecked landing craft, broken obstacles, and fallen soldiers. Smoke curled into the sky from burning bunkers and destroyed positions, reducing visibility and filling the air with acrid fumes. Every step through this chaotic battlefield required vigilance and courage. Yet even the bravest men felt the psychological toll of repeated exposure to violence and death. In some positions, soldiers huddled together in temporary cover, speaking in hushed tones or praying silently. Others continued to fire until their weapons were empty, refusing to yield even as the tide of attackers pressed ever closer. The combination of fear, fatigue, and determination created an almost surreal state, where survival became the only focus, and every action was measured against the immediate threat of death. Isolation was another enemy. Small groups of men, separated from their units, moved cautiously through the wreckage, unsure where allies or enemies might be. Some attempted to regroup, while others simply focused on moving forward, one step at a time, hoping to reach a safer position. Each movement was calculated, yet every choice carried risk. A misstep could expose them to enemy fire or force them into untenable positions. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the beaches and highlighting the devastation. Survivors looked across the dunes and saw the scale of the invasion, the success of the attackers, and the futility of resistance in many sectors. Some pressed on, driven by the instinct to survive. Others collapsed, too exhausted to move, too overwhelmed to continue. The human cost of the morning and afternoon was visible in every crater, bunker, and stretch of sand. By evening, the German soldiers were not only physically depleted, but mentally burdened. The relentless pressure of combat, the collapse of fortifications, the absence of reinforcements, and the overwhelming enemy presence combined to create an environment of near-total despair. Survival depended on willpower, improvisation, and sheer endurance. Amid this exhaustion, moments of courage persisted. A soldier might fire one last burst, cover a comrade's retreat, or drag the wounded to relative safety. These acts, small in the context of the massive invasion, were remarkable tests of endurance and humanity. Yet even these moments could not hide the reality. The defenders were broken, scattered, and fighting a battle that had already stretched them beyond human limits. As darkness approached, the beaches were littered with the remnants of the day's struggle, a battlefield scarred by fire, smoke, and human suffering. German soldiers faced a long night ahead, fraught with uncertainty, danger, and the lingering knowledge that the invasion was only beginning. Exhaustion and despair were palpable, but the instinct to survive remained, compelling men to move, fight, and endure in the face of overwhelming odds. Night fell over the beaches of Normandy, but darkness offered little relief to the surviving German soldiers. The once pristine coastline was now a devastated landscape of sand, rubble, smoke, and fire. Bunkers that had survived the day offered meager protection, and open fields and craters provided only the illusion of safety. Exhaustion weighed heavily on every man, yet sleep was impossible. The horrors of the day, the thunder of artillery, the screams of the fallen, the relentless advance of the Allies, continued to echo in their minds, refusing to let them rest. Many survivors huddled in ruined bunkers, pressed against crumbling walls, listening intently to the night. Each distant crack, rustle, or muffled shout set hearts racing. Shadows cast by fires flickered across sand and debris, playing tricks on weary eyes. Soldiers were haunted not only by fear of enemy attack, but by memories of comrades lost in the relentless daylight assault. The smell of gunpowder and smoke lingered, mixing with the temps of blood, sweat, and fear, creating an atmosphere of suffocating tension. Fields, ditches, and small hedgerows became temporary refuges for retreating units. Men crouched low, weapons at the ready, waiting for movement that might signify another attack. Some whispered prayers or recited silent oaths to survive, while others simply stared into the darkness, unable to think of anything beyond the immediate struggle to stay alive. The night was alive with danger. Snipers, patrols, and sporadic artillery fire reminded the soldiers that even darkness was no sanctuary. Sleep deprivation intensified every sensation. Exhaustion blurred lines between reality and memory, making distant sounds seem closer. Shadows appear alive, and every crack or rustle a potential threat. Soldiers' minds replayed the day over and over. The chaos of the beaches, the collapse of bunkers, the screams and shouts, the smell of blood and sand. Even in hiding, the human mind struggled to process the trauma of relentless combat, and every small noise became a trigger of panic or dread. Attempts to regroup were cautious and dangerous. Small groups moved between craters, destroyed vehicles, or fallen obstacles, checking on wounded comrades or seeking better cover. Any light, movement, or sound risked attracting attention from snipers or enemy patrols. Darkness did not guarantee safety. It magnified the uncertainty, forcing men to move with extreme care and constant vigilance. Some soldiers tried to make the best of their brief moments of reprieve. They cleaned weapons, patched minor injuries, or whispered words of encouragement to each other. Yet the knowledge that the enemy could strike at any moment prevented true rest. The line between survival and death had never been so fragile, and every action was calculated to maintain life for at least another hour, another minute. The night was punctuated by distant artillery, occasional gunfire, and the haunting cries of men lost to the chaos. The battlefield, once defined by clear front lines, was now a fractured expanse of danger and uncertainty. Soldiers learned quickly that the horrors of the day did not end with sunset. The night brought its own challenges, equally lethal in a quieter, more insidious form. In the dim light of fires or lanterns, men huddled close together, seeking comfort in numbers while fearing the vulnerability that proximity could bring. Conversations were whispered, often fragmented, as the mind struggled to focus through fatigue and fear. Memories of fallen comrades, the screams of the wounded, and the collapse of positions earlier in the day haunted every thought. Sleep was fleeting or non-existent. Some tried to close their eyes only to be jolted awake by distant explosions or imagined threats. The mind replayed every decision, every shot fired, and every moment of hesitation, leaving a mental exhaustion that rivaled the physical toll. The night became a long, unbroken vigil, a continuation of the day's horrors in a quieter, darker form. By the early hours of morning, German soldiers remained on edge. Those who survived the beaches faced the reality that the invasion was far from over. The night offered no rest, no respite, only the unyielding reminder that survival would require endurance, vigilance, and the courage to face the next day's battles, whatever form they might take. By the morning after the first waves of invasion, the beaches and surrounding countryside were a mixture of chaos, smoke, and scattered resistance. German soldiers who had survived the initial onslaught faced impossible choices: stand and risk being killed, surrender to the advancing Allied forces, or attempt to slip away into the countryside. Each choice carried its own dangers, and survival was uncertain for all. Those captured by Allied troops often did so reluctantly. Men raised their hands, weapons lowered, acknowledging defeat in the hope of survival. The surrender was accompanied by relief, fear, and humiliation. Allied soldiers moved swiftly, rounding up prisoners while maintaining pressure on still contested positions. Some Germans were taken in large groups, herded together on the sand, while others were captured individually, emerging from hiding or overwhelmed during retreat. Captivity offered a temporary end to the immediate threat of death, but it also meant a long, uncertain journey far from home and the constant psychological strain of being at the mercy of the enemy. Others refused to surrender, instead attempting to disappear into the Norman countryside. Retreating units, already fragmented, moved cautiously through hedgerows, farmyards, and small roads, often disoriented by the destruction and chaos. The terrain offered some cover but also concealed dangers. Hidden patrols, snipers, and booby traps left by both sides created a maze of uncertainty. Exhaustion, hunger, and disorientation made each step a struggle. Soldiers relied on memory, instinct, and luck to navigate, moving silently and keeping close to one another when possible. The landscape itself bore the scars of battle. Craters, broken equipment, and fallen soldiers littered roads and fields. Smoke from fires and the remnants of artillery bombardment hung in the air, masking movement but also creating disorientation. Every sound, the distant crack of gunfire, the whistle of a shell, or even the rustling of leaves, could signal imminent danger. Men moved cautiously, often crawling or crouching, acutely aware that visibility and noise could reveal their positions to enemy forces. Psychological strain was immense. Soldiers who escaped the beaches were exhausted, traumatized, and uncertain of what lay ahead. Some wandered alone, isolated from comrades, relying solely on survival instincts. Others formed small groups, attempting to maintain cohesion despite dwindling numbers and lack of supplies. The retreat was slow and mentally taxing. Every step forward was measured against potential exposure to enemy patrols or ambushes. Those who had been captured faced a different kind of trial. Guarded and sometimes questioned, they were removed from the battlefield, observing from a distance the destruction and chaos that had consumed their positions. Many reflected on the futility of the day's resistance, haunted by the collapse of the Atlantic Wall and the relentless advance of Allied forces. Even in captivity, the mental burden of the day lingered, a reminder of the immense human cost of the invasion. For those still free, the countryside became a dangerous labyrinth. Hedgerows, farm fences, and ruined villages offered temporary cover, but the Allies controlled key roads and crossings, cutting off potential escape routes. Soldiers relied on silence, shadows, and intuition to move undetected. Each decision was critical. A single misstep could lead to capture, injury, or death. The dichotomy of fate was stark. Some men would spend the remainder of the war as prisoners of the Allies, enduring long marches, camps, and uncertainty. Others, through a combination of skill, luck, and endurance, would evade capture and slip further into the countryside, surviving against the odds. Both outcomes were shaped by the relentless pressure of the invasion, the collapse of defensive positions, and the exhaustion that had gripped every surviving defender. By the end of the morning, the beaches were largely under Allied control. The remaining German soldiers were either captured, scattered in small, isolated groups, or slowly making their way inland. The battlefield was quiet in comparison to the previous day, but the consequences of D-Day were starkly visible. Shattered defenses, fallen comrades, and a landscape transformed into a testament to human endurance, bravery, and the grim reality of war. The survivors, whether captured or escaped, carried with them the memory of chaos, fear, and the relentless push of an enemy that had overwhelmed even the most prepared defenses. For those who fled, the struggle for survival would continue in the days and weeks to come. Navigating a countryside scarred by battle and haunted by the echoes of a devastating day. Days after the invasion, a surviving German soldier sits quietly in a ruined farmhouse. The chaos of D-Day, now a memory that refuses to fade. The streets are still marked with the devastation of the beaches and countryside. Craters pokemark the fields. Shattered bunkers crumble under the sun, and the remnants of equipment lie scattered like discarded toys. Yet amidst this destruction, a fragile silence has settled, a deceptive calm that belies the relentless, terrifying intensity of what transpired. The soldier's mind drifts back to that morning, to the low hum of distant engines, the first flashes of naval bombardments, and the waves of landing craft stretching across the horizon. He remembers the confusion in the bunkers, the terror mingled with determination, and the bitter knowledge that the impregnable Atlantic Wall had proven fragile. He recalls comrades falling beside him, the cries that still echo in memory. and the suffocating fear that pressed down with every wave of advancing Allied troops. Exhaustion and grief intertwine with vivid recollections of courage and desperation. He recalls moments of small triumph, a machine gun nest holding long enough to slow an advance, a comrade dragging the wounded to safety, a brief, futile counterattack that reminded them of their training and discipline. Each act, though ultimately unable to stop the invasion, carried meaning and affirmed their resolve in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet, for all the courage, the soldier cannot escape the sense of inevitability. D-Day was a turning point, a thunderous herald of the shift in the war's momentum. He reflects on the futility of the retreat across the hedgerows, the ambushes by Allied paratroopers, and the slow, agonizing collapse of the Atlantic Wall. Every decision, every action, had been measured against the relentless tide of the invasion, and each choice had revealed the fragile limits of human endurance in war. The mind returns to the night after the landings, when sleep was impossible and every sound carried the threat of discovery or death. Shadows, smoke, and the cries of the fallen had merged into a surreal landscape of fear. Even now, days later, the echoes of that night linger, a constant reminder of how quickly certainty can dissolve into chaos, and how fleeting moments of respite can be amid the horrors of battle. He remembers those who were captured, those who escaped, and the disorienting experience of wandering through the Norman countryside, uncertain of friend or foe. Survival had demanded vigilance, instinct, and the bitter acceptance that some losses were unavoidable. The battlefield was not just a place of violence. It was a test of endurance, mental fortitude, and the will to continue despite overwhelming adversity. Sitting in silence, the soldier contemplates the scale of what occurred. The invasion was not a simple defeat, but a transformation of reality. The tide of war had shifted irrevocably, and Germany's once confident defenses were rendered powerless in the face of coordinated, relentless assault. D-Day had been more than a battle. It was the day that revealed the vulnerability of what had been thought invincible, and the day that forced a stark confrontation with the inevitability of loss. The memories are heavy, but within them lies a quiet understanding. Courage, fear, desperation, and endurance coexist in the mind of a survivor. The chaos, smoke, and thunder of D-Day remain vivid. Yet the survivor also recognizes the fleeting moments of humanity, the camaraderie, the acts of defiance, the brief intervals of hope amidst despair. These memories, though painful, preserve the story of those who endured when so many did not. As he gazes over the shattered countryside, the soldier is left with the unshakable knowledge that the world has changed. The beaches, the hedgerows, the ruined bunkers, all bear witness to the enormity of the invasion and the relentless determination of the Allied forces. D-Day becomes a day of reckoning, a day of fear and inevitability. And the moment when the war's trajectory shifted irreversibly, in silence he reflects, not only on the horror and loss, but on the resilience of those who survived. D-Day was a testament to the extremes of human courage and the profound consequences of conflict. The memory of that day lingers, haunting and instructive, a reminder of the fragility of life, the weight of duty, and the inexorable passage of history.